Thank you, Ken. It's nice to have others up here. We've been lonely. In the story you just heard from the gospel, people mostly notice that widow. She is a woman without a man in a man's world in that time and place. So she's vulnerable. She's already got some things stacked against her, in addition to the loss she has experienced. And we hear in the story that she's poor. She's got 2 cents to her name. And so we tend to notice she gives the whole of what she has. She somehow entrusts herself to God. She shares every single thing that she has, even though it's not very much. And one of the reasons we notice her is because Jesus is noticing her. He's with his disciples, and he does a little compare and contrast. There are people who coming up to the temple treasury, putting in much larger sums of money, but proportionally, they're holding back. They're not offering in the great generosity that we see the widow offering. And so there is this idea of celebrating this widow as this model of trust and generosity, and certainly there's that angle of the story. But I remember when I first was challenged to go deeper with the story by New Testament professor Greg Carey, who's also a United Church of Christ ordained clergy person. And in his book, Sinners, the Earliest Followers of Jesus, which I love that title, by the way, Sinners, the Earliest Followers of Jesus, he points out, as you heard Ken read, that there's some context for this story. The first thing that we notice is that Jesus is condemning, challenging religious leaders who devour everything that widows have, who take advantage of that vulnerability and the trust and the generosity and consume the households of widows. And then we hear that Jesus is sitting opposite the temple treasury, which is quite likely a literary device to help us understand that Jesus is opposed, opposite of, the corrupt, at this point, religious system that devours widows' households. And in case we had any doubt about that, later, Jesus will disrupt the economics of the temple and declare that the temple has become a hideout for thieves. And so we're seeing Jesus is not endorsing necessarily where the money's going or what it's supporting, even as he may be celebrating the generosity of the widow. Jesus is challenging. Jesus is challenging and causing us to ask questions like, in a society, the society of that time and place, where there is an understanding there to have allegiance to God who calls for the community to take care of those who are on the margins. And specifically, as you heard in the psalm, lifts up orphans and widows. Why the heck is there a widow with only 2 cents to her name? That's the challenge. That should not be in that time and place. Jesus is lifting up, there's a widow with just 2 pennies to rub together in a society that's supposed to be caring for the widow, for the people on the margins. And I think about how in our own society, there are times where we might celebrate incredible generosity or creativity in helping other people. I've seen, and probably you have seen, stories, whether they make the news or you've seen them in your social media posts, but I remember one where there was a child, and in his school district there had been funding cuts for the hot meal program for his school. And so this child created a fundraiser so that the other children in his school could eat. And the reason it was shared was, look at this kid. How generous, how creative, how wonderful. And that's true. But then behind that is the question, what kind of society has children doing fundraisers to feed other children? Are we living Lord of the Flies or something? So that's the challenge in the story. Jesus is calling us to pay attention not only to examples of generosity, but also to be awake to the ways that we create systems and structures that hurt people. I think about how in the story there's the compare and contrast of the widow who's poor, who's giving everything, and then people who are wealthy, who are giving bigger amounts than her, but are still holding back. Probably in all aspects taking more than giving. And we see this borne out. There's an article I read in the Journal of Philanthropy that did great research on giving patterns across the United States. And in terms of annual income, the least generous communities in the United States in terms of helping other people were in the major metros of the Northeast. And the most generous communities in the United States in terms of proportion of income helping other people were small communities in the southeastern United States, especially among people of color. And it's a much smaller data set, but I saw this reflected in one church I served where the stewardship committee said, let's take a look at how is our own congregation doing with generosity. And there's this biblical notion of tithe, even though it's not necessarily clear and it can be confusing, but some idea of sharing 10%. Well, let's look at percentages, they said. And they put out an anonymous survey to the church. I mean, it's anonymous because, we're congregational. And so in the survey, there was categories of annual income levels. And then there was ways to indicate how much you gave. There was to the church specifically, but it wasn't limited to the church. It was any charity nonprofit. So it was looking at the overall giving outside of your own needs. And in that church that I was serving, we found that the people in the bottom third of our income bracket, on average, so these are averages, right? There's exceptions, but on average, were giving away 6% of their income. That's big. And the people in the top third were giving away 1.8%. So, and there can be all kinds of reasons that this might be, but still it was interesting to see the same kind of contrast that Jesus is seeing at the temple. And so there's this recognition, this challenge, that there are ways that we perhaps sometimes take more than give, ways that we live in scarcity, ways that we are afraid to be extravagantly generous. And, well, then we miss out on something, Jesus is pointing out, but also we create systems and structures where widows have 2 pennies and children are raising money so that their fellow students can eat. And he's calling that to our attention, challenging that. And I think intellectually, most of us would understand, all right, yeah, it's probably better for everyone when we can be generous, when we can share more of who we are and what we have. But yet there is this tendency, especially sometimes the more we have, again, exceptions, but the more we have, often it can be even harder to let it go. That we might say that sometimes it's because we've got more to protect, more to take care of. There's also this idea as human beings, it's hard for us to know when enough is enough. I remember when I mean, this is so wrong on a lot of levels, but it was just the culture of the time. When I won goldfish at a carnival in my school, right? Oh, sorry, PETA. But, there's the bowl. We buy the bowl. I mean, it's that burden on the poor parent. My single mother's like, okay, now I got to get goldfish food in a bowl and I'll take care of it. But they were Scooby and Dooby, were my goldfish. But I was told, don't feed them too much. They don't know when to stop. They will eat themselves to death. That might be instructions for humans too, right? I mean, we evolve in a time where there is scarcity. I mean, if we think about throughout most of human history, there just wasn't enough. So if you found sugar and fats or whatever, you took it, right? So you'd survive the lean times. But so that's still in us, but then we don't know, when's enough? And so there's a sense of, well, shouldn't I get more or have more or do, take in more? And that can be about all kinds of things. Maybe that's why Jesus said it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to be part of God's reign. He didn't say it was impossible. He's just saying it's hard. So why do we sometimes live in that place of scarcity? Well, I think about the widow and a question we were posing here a few weeks ago, where she gives her all. So if someone came up to you today and said, will you give away every single thing that you have? What are you going to say? It's all right. No is the answer. Like, are we graded on this, Michael? Right, because if we follow that through, well, if I give away every single thing that I have, then how am I going to eat? Where am I going to live? Maybe no one's going to take care of me, right? So then now I'm poor. And the threat is my very survival. If I give away everything that I have, I could die. There's the rub. I mean, Hobbes suggested that every decision is rooted in a fear of death. And whether that's true or not, I think it's still a factor, even unconsciously. So our survival can be at stake, and it's hard to know when is there enough. So what do we do about that? Because it is the condition, it's how we live, how we're wired. Well, our psalmist says, well, here, don't put your trust in things that perish. If you start making a list of things that perish, that don't last forever, all right, it's everything, right? Pretty much every single thing. And he says, so put your trust instead in God. That's where you start. And first, so we might say there's an awakening to the ways that we're not always conscious of it. We put our trust in our stuff, in our things, in our income, whatever that is. That's where we center ourselves and put our trust. And Jesus talks about that same thing, that you have to lose life or let go of that, trusting in that kind of biological living so you can live something deeper and wider. It doesn't mean that you don't need to eat or pay your bills. It's just, where are you centered? Where are you starting? What's your foundation or your grounding? And I think this is really important. Jesus, in terms of generosity, in terms of not holding back, he doesn't say, you should feel ashamed and guilty that you don't give enough, just try harder. Some of you grew up with those sermons, didn't you? Jesus knows that if we're already feeling dried up, desiccated, squeezing people harder isn't going to produce more juice. What Jesus teaches is, go to the well, come to the table. You need to eat and drink of Spirit. You need a better story to be in the flow of God's abundance and healing, the fullness of life. Start there. That's why when Jesus is asked what's the greatest commandment, he didn't say, love your neighbor and love your enemy. He says that later, but he starts with love God, because he knows you can't give away what you don't have. So Jesus teaches and models that you start with opening yourself to the power and presence of God in all the ways that you know how. To put yourself in front of the stories of generosity and abundance and creativity and beauty. Put that in front of you so that that's more embodied, taken into you, and then we live from that place. And the more we live from that place, the less we're going to hold back, and the more that we're part of creating a world where widows don't just have 2 pennies and children aren't doing fundraisers to feed each other lunch. I think of a story I came across a number of years ago that has stayed with me about a woman named Veronica Scott. Veronica grew up in the Detroit, Michigan area and was the child of 2 drug-addicted parents. And so she lived with a lot of instability and insecurity growing up. A lot of scarcity, a lot of fear. It was just part of the fabric of her life. And growing up in a neighborhood as an African-American woman in Detroit, Michigan, with addict parents, a lot of things stacked against her. But she also had people who offered generosity to her and with her. For example, a teacher in school who helped her to see that she had creative gifts, who helped her to trust that she could do something with those creative gifts. Or later in life, where as she is seeing that there's possibilities, she applies to a design school where someone has created a very large endowment to have scholarships for people like Veronica. Someone offered that kind of abundance, and she was able to receive it. So she goes to design school, and one of their assignments is to engage the work of design as a social enterprise to do good in the community as an exercise for school. So Veronica, she has a sense of her own call to help homeless folks in Detroit. And so she does not, though, like I sometimes think happens, she doesn't go into some room where she says, I think this is what homeless people need. She went onto the streets, and she talked, and she listened, and she watched. And one of the things she noticed, that homeless people in Detroit because it gets really cold, have to carry a lot of things around just to survive, and there's nowhere to store it. So you have to have a coat, but you have to have blankets and sleeping bag. I mean, just all the stuff she saw, and here's what she came up with, and it was brilliant. She designed a winter coat that converted into a sleeping bag. Right? Go Veronica. And so, right, you're wearing your coat during the day, and then it's like a transformer toy, but it, turned into that sleeping bag at night to keep people alive. And there were grant monies, and there started this little workshop factory where they were making these, and she stayed invested in the project, and she was helping distribute these coat/sleeping bags on the streets of Detroit. And there were a lot of people like, thank you, and this is wonderful. But one day, as she is distributing these coats, a homeless woman says to her, "We don't need coats, we need jobs." Now, some people could have received that as ungrateful homeless person. You should be lucky I'm out here giving you anything. That's not Veronica. Veronica is someone who did grow up with some tradition and stories of listening for the cries of the vulnerable. So she heard. And so she also kept listening. And she listened to other advisors, and she talked with people, and she pondered, and here's what she came up with. Why don't we hire homeless women to work in the factory that's making the coats and sleeping bags? And that's what they did. So brought in not only income to take people off the streets, but a sense of worth and value, helping people who've been in the exact same situation that you were in. Transformative for a community of people, because she was willing to risk, to listen, and to give of herself. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. That's what we're both challenged and blessed to hear if we have ears to hear. It's easy to default, give a little here and there, but let's just hang on, because God knows what if something bad happens, right? There's the fear and the scarcity. We know how to do that. Everyone knows how to do that. Easy, it's the default. The more challenging thing is to wake up to the ways that we sometimes do that create the systems and structures of widows with 2 coins and children doing fundraisers to feed each other. And that instead, we can awaken to, I don't want to just put my trust in my stuff, and be intentional in how do I nurture trust in God? How do I come to the well, come to the table? All the practices and community and solitude, whatever does that for you, do it. Because then we're on the receiving end of creativity, of abundance, of generosity, of justice, and then we live creativity, abundance, generosity, and justice. And when we do that, it's good news for us and for the whole world. Jesus shows us the way. Come and see. Amen. Where